When we think of ancient Greece, we imagine marble temples bathed in sunlight, the voices of philosophers echoing through the agora, and the beauty of statues carved to embody harmony and perfection. Greece is remembered as the cradle of democracy, of philosophy, of reason itself. Yet behind the brilliance of its achievements lay shadows darker than its myths would ever admit. For in the private chambers of its citizens, in the dim sanctuaries of its temples, and in the riotous festivals that filled its streets, practices unfolded that modern eyes would find shocking, even horrifying. Acts bound in ritual, cloaked in tradition, and sanctioned by society became part of daily life. Desire was not always tender, nor was pleasure always free. Often it was power, control, and humiliation that shaped the body's role in Greek society. Behind the veneer of refinement, the Greeks blurred the line between devotion and indulgence, between sacred ritual and carnal excess. What was celebrated as an offering to the gods could in truth be little more than frenzy and abuse. What was honored as a bond between men might conceal domination and submission, and what was tolerated in silence often left scars invisible to the marble perfection they carved. This is not the story of philosophers or heroes, but of the shadows that lived among them. This is the hidden tale of the most horrifying sexual practices of ancient Greece. Welcome to Scroll Historian. Here we unroll the forgotten pages of the past, stories of power, fear, and silence that history tried to hide. If you enjoy journeys into these hidden chapters, I invite you to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps keep history alive and ensures these stories reach others who seek to understand the shadows of the past. Now, let us begin. Pleasure and power. In the Greek polis, desire was never only a matter of intimacy, it was a matter of power. Sexuality shaped hierarchies as firmly as wealth or bloodline, and to possess another was often to demonstrate dominance. Pleasure was entangled with control, and bodies became instruments of politics, influence, and humiliation. Among men of status, conquest extended beyond the battlefield. To take a lover, especially one beneath their rank, was not simply indulgence, it was a statement. It displayed authority, declaring before others that one held mastery not only in the public sphere but in the private as well. In this way, Eros became another theatre of competition, where the body of another could testify to one's strength. For slaves, this truth was inescapable. Their bodies were considered property, subject to the desires of their masters. A household could be judged by the beauty of the youths it contained, and many enslaved boys and girls lived lives where obedience meant submission to demands they could never refuse. What some in Athens or Sparta considered refined privilege was, in truth, the silent exploitation of the powerless. In such a world, sex was rarely an act of equality. It was an extension of hierarchy, a stage where dominance was rehearsed again and again. Behind the elegant phrases of philosophers and the ideals carved into stone, there existed an intimacy shaped less by love than by control. In Greece, sexual acts often moved beyond the privacy of chambers and into the public stage of reputation. A man's role in intimacy could shape how he was judged in politics, philosophy, and daily life. To dominate was a mark of strength, but to be dominated, especially by another man, was considered a stain upon honor. It was not desire itself that drew scorn, but the position one occupied within it. This obsession with roles made sexuality into a theatre of humiliation. Satirists mocked rivals by portraying them as passive partners, poets sharpened insults through accusations of submission, and sculptors carved scenes that celebrated virility while sneering at weakness. A man might conquer cities, yet his enemies would attack his reputation not on the battlefield but in whispers about his pleasures. Women too bore the weight of this dynamic, though in different form. In many households, wives were confined to silence, while hetairai courtesans trained in music and speech were celebrated for their wit and allure, yet often reduced to instruments of pleasure for gatherings of men. The boundaries between admiration and exploitation blurred, leaving women praised for beauty yet denied true power. Thus, in the heart of the polis, sexuality became less about intimacy than about spectacle. It was woven into politics, into gossip, into the very language of honor and shame. What might seem like private indulgence was in truth another battlefield, one where the body became both a prize and a weapon. Rituals of the gods. The Greeks did not confine sexuality to private spaces. They wove it into their religion, binding desire to ritual and indulgence to the worship of the gods. Among the Olympians, none demanded it more openly than Dionysus, god of wine, frenzy, and ecstasy. His festivals, the Dionysia, blurred the line between devotion and excess, between the sacred and the profane. By torchlight and drum, men and women filled the night with chants, their voices rising in intoxication. Wine flowed without measure, music pulsed without pause, and bodies surrendered to movements that abandoned reason. What began as ritual often descended into chaos, dances collapsing into embraces, embraces into acts that stripped away the boundaries of propriety. To the faithful, this was divine ecstasy, a moment where the god himself entered the flesh. To others, it was little more than sanctioned madness. In honor of Aphrodite, goddess of love, temples became theaters of pleasure. Offerings were not only of incense and flowers, but of flesh. Courtesans and priestesses alike were said to serve as instruments of worship, their bodies presented as sacrifices of beauty and desire. Pilgrims entered not only to pray but to participate, believing that to touch or to taste within her sanctuary was to brush against the divine. In these rites, the Greeks gave sanctity to indulgence, yet behind the veil of piety, abuse often flourished, for frenzy excuses much, and devotion cloaked acts that were neither sacred nor just. The frenzy of these rites often erased the line between worship and violation. In the shadows of Dionysian festivals, when wine and music drowned restraint, what began as dance could end in violence. Stories spoke of men and women taken against their will, their cries masked by the chorus of drums. To the crowd it was ecstasy, to the victim it was horror, sanctified by ritual. In some cults, blood mingled with pleasure. Devotees believed that to reach the divine, one must abandon all shame, all boundaries. Acts that in daylight would have drawn outrage were in these moments not only tolerated but celebrated as offerings to the gods. The darker the transgression, the stronger the proof of devotion. Even the myths reinforced this union of passion and brutality. The tales of gods themselves were filled with desire, unbounded by consent. Zeus, disguised in countless forms, took lovers by force as often as by charm. Dionysus, in legend, drove mortals into such frenzies that they tore apart animals, and in darker whispers, even each other. These stories, retold in temples and theatres, gave divine sanction to indulgences that stripped away humanity. Thus, the Greeks wove their gods not only into the noblest virtues, but into the most primal hungers. In worship they found ecstasy, but in that ecstasy they also found permission for acts that turned devotion into desecration. Boys, masters, and slaves. Among the customs of ancient Greece, few are as troubling to modernize as the practice of pederasty, the sanctioned relationship between an older man, often a citizen of standing, and a younger boy, usually in his teens. To the Greeks, it was framed as mentorship, an education in philosophy, politics, and the art of war. But beneath this noble disguise lay a dynamic of power and desire that blurred the line between teaching and exploitation. In Athens, these relationships were woven into the very fabric of society. The elder, known as the Erastes, claimed the role of guide and protector. The boy, the Eromenos, was expected to yield, to learn, to embody the beauty and obedience that Greek culture so highly prized. To many, this was a pathway to manhood. Yet, for the youths themselves, it was also surrender, their bodies as much a part of the arrangement as their minds. Such unions were celebrated in poetry and art. Vases depicted older men courting boys with gifts of hairs or wreaths, their gestures presented as tender, even honorable. Philosophers spoke of these bonds as conduits of virtue, as ladders toward wisdom and strength, but the beauty of words and images concealed the truth, that choice was often absent, and consent, as we understand it today, was rarely considered. For the Greeks, these practices carried no shame. They were traditions, as familiar as the gymnasium or the symposium. Yet in the silence of history we hear another truth, that what was celebrated as mentorship was, in many cases, the mastery of one body over another. If freeborn youths could at least claim the protection of custom, enslaved boys and girls had no such shield. For them, the arrangement was not framed as education or mentorship, it was simply ownership. Their beauty was appraised like cattle, their obedience demanded without question, and their bodies treated as property to be used at will. In wealthy households, slaves often became part of the private chambers, chosen for their appearance as much as for their service. They were trained to remain silent, to anticipate desire before it was spoken, and to endure without resistance. Their youth, fleeting and fragile, was consumed quickly, leaving behind only the scars of a life where they were never more than possessions. The symposium, that emblem of Greek intellectual life, was also a theatre of such subjugation. Boys served wine to philosophers and politicians, their presence both ornamental and functional. What appeared as refined conversation under lamplight was in truth often accompanied by gestures that stripped away dignity and blurred the line between servant and spectacle. For these enslaved youths, there was no poetry to sanctify their experience, no vase painting to immortalize their suffering as noble tradition. They existed in silence, their stories unrecorded, their names forgotten, and yet their presence haunts the margins of Greek history, a reminder that even in a civilization praised for its reason and beauty, cruelty was written into the fabric of daily life. Theatres of lust. In the streets of Athens, desire was not hidden. It was bought, sold, and displayed as openly as bread in the market. Prostitution, both male and female, was woven into the fabric of the city, accepted not as shame but as commerce. Behind doors marked with simple symbols, in narrow alleys lit by torchlight, bodies were traded for coins, and pleasure became another marketplace. Women filled the brothels, their lives bound to service from youth until age made them undesirable. Some were slaves, compelled into the trade by their owners. Others were free but driven by poverty into selling themselves to survive. Their beauty was consumed by strangers night after night, and their voices, if heard at all, were drowned in laughter and drunken song. But the trade did not belong to women alone. Boys too were offered, their youth advertised as a luxury for those willing to pay. Wealthy men who could not claim apprentices through custom found them in brothels instead, their silver buying what society would not grant openly. These boys became both objects of indulgence and symbols of wealth, proof that their patrons could afford even the most forbidden pleasures. The Greeks spoke of freedom, of democracy, of equality among men. Yet in the flickering light of brothels, that freedom ended at the threshold. Inside, the powerless sold their bodies to the powerful, and lust became another theatre where inequality played out in plain sight. Sex in Greece was not confined to the brothel or the private chamber. It often spilled into the realm of spectacle, where intimacy became performance, and lust was woven into the fabric of entertainment. In taverns and public houses, courtesans and hired youths danced for the amusement of men, their movements deliberate, their bodies displayed like offerings before an audience. Even the theatre, birthplace of tragedy and comedy, was not untouched by this hunger. Beneath masks and costumes, actors carried reputations not only for their roles, but for their indulgences. Audiences laughed at bawdy plays that mocked sexual excess, yet those same jokes revealed a society that tolerated what it pretended to scorn. Behind the curtain, liaisons between performers and patrons blurred the line between art and transaction. The symposium, too, became a stage for lust. Between cups of wine and verses of poetry, men summoned musicians, dancers, and companions whose presence promised more than music. These gatherings, celebrated as centers of philosophy and wit, were also arenas where bodies became entertainment, their dignity stripped for the amusement of those reclining in luxury. Thus, what began as private indulgence transformed into a public spectacle, a normalization of desire that erased boundaries between pleasure and performance. To the Greeks, this was not scandal but custom, proof that in their world, lust was not hidden in shadows but celebrated in the open, even when it consumed those with no choice but to serve. Violence and desire. In the myths of Greece, desire was rarely gentle. The gods themselves pursued mortals with a hunger that disregarded resistance. Their stories retold as lessons but also as justifications. Zeus, king of the gods, descended from Olympus in countless forms: a swan, a bull, a shower of gold, to seize women who had no power to refuse. What was celebrated in art as divine union was in truth violence sanctified by myth. These tales echoed into daily life. If the gods could take what they wished, then men too could claim their desires as natural. Acts that today would be called violation were often framed as passion, proof of virility, or even favor from the divine. Victims became footnotes in stories meant to glorify power, their suffering erased beneath the grandeur of legend. Even within human society, this logic prevailed. In war, women taken as captives were not only spoils of victory, but instruments of humiliation against the enemy. In marriage, wives were expected to yield without question, their silence mistaken for consent. The Greek language itself carried this hierarchy, where words for love and words for conquest often blurred into one. Thus, violence became stitched into the fabric of desire, a shadow carried by the very culture that spoke of beauty, virtue, and harmony. What philosophers praised as noble eros was, for many, a mask concealing a reality where intimacy was often bound not by tenderness, but by force. Among the most troubling of these tales was that of Ganymede, the beautiful boy whom Zeus seized and carried to Olympus. There, against his will, he was made cupbearer to the gods, a role both exalted and humiliating. Artists carved his likeness into vases, poets praised his beauty, and philosophers even cited the story as a divine model of love between men. Yet beneath the admiration lay an unsettling truth. It was abduction turned into myth, desire justified by power. Such stories blurred the boundaries between honor and violation. To emulate Zeus was not to love but to conquer. In Athens and Sparta alike, relationships that began with affection could just as easily slip into coercion, masked as tradition, or disguised as mentorship. When myths sanctified force, society followed, often erasing the suffering of those without the power to speak. Even in the theatre, violence and desire walked hand in hand. Tragedies depicted women abducted, shamed, or sacrificed in the name of gods and heroes. Audiences wept, yet few questioned the underlying message that passion and brutality were bound together, and that the will of the powerful outweighed the cries of the powerless. In this way, Greek culture, celebrated for its pursuit of reason and virtue, enshrined stories that legitimized domination. What should have served as warnings instead became examples, shaping a society where violence could wear the mask of love and desire could be excused as fate, legacy of darkness. Ancient Greece left to the world monuments of philosophy, art, and politics, the ideals of beauty, reason, and freedom that continue to shape our imaginations. Yet beneath that brilliance lies a legacy often unspoken, a culture where sexuality was bound to hierarchy, ritual, and violence. The very society that built temples to wisdom also sanctified practices that blurred the line between love and exploitation. For centuries, scholars praised Greece as the cradle of civilization, glossing over the shadows in its traditions. The poetry of Sappho was celebrated, while the silence of enslaved girls was ignored. The dialogues of Plato exalted noble eros, while the coerced voices of boys in symposia were left unrecorded. What survived in marble and ink was the vision of the powerful, not the testimony of the powerless. Yet the fragments of truth remain. In vases and myths, in whispered anecdotes and scattered records, we see the outlines of a world where desire was not always tender, where beauty was often bound to suffering, and where the brilliance of Greece carried with it a darkness rarely acknowledged. The legacy of these practices is contradiction itself, a civilization remembered for harmony, yet haunted by shadows of indulgence and cruelty. The memory of Greece is one of brilliance, shadowed by silence. Its philosophers taught of virtue, yet their society often excused exploitation. Its poets praised beauty, yet that beauty was sometimes bound to humiliation and suffering. Its gods embodied passion, yet that passion often came cloaked in violence. To celebrate Greece is to celebrate both its light and its darkness. These practices, horrifying to modern eyes, remind us that civilizations are never only what they wish to be remembered for. The same marble that gleams in the sunlight of the Acropolis also casts a shadow, and within that shadow lived countless lives unrecorded, their voices lost beneath the weight of myth and glory. And so the legacy of ancient Greece is not only democracy, philosophy and art, but also the hidden story of desire twisted into power, of rituals that blurred worship and abuse, of intimacy bound to control. Its greatness cannot be separated from its cruelty. Both endure side by side as warnings carved into history. This is the true paradox of Greece, the cradle of civilization, and yet also the keeper of practices that reveal how even the brightest cultures carry their own darkness.